I wanted to start really by saying a little bit about the reason why you're here. And that comes from really two initiatives, two separate things going on in the UK. I suspect that in the breaks, all of you from overseas are going to be grilling us about Brexit, but there is more than Brexit going on. So the first of these two initiatives that led to this meeting came from the Development Studies Association, and the wish of the Development Studies Association to reach out beyond development studies. So the Development Studies Association is a grouping of UK academics working in broadly the field of development studies. About 5 years ago now, the government shifted a large amount of money, 1.5 billion, from broadly DFID into support for research, the Global Challenges Research Fund. The motivation for this was, I think, in part a desire to support research. It was also a feeling that in order for the 0.7% aid commitment to last, there needed to be a stronger lobby beyond DFID. That's my sense about it. It has been somewhat controversial, not so much the GCRF, but the disbursement of the UK commitment to development aid beyond DFID. The Independent Commission on Aid has written quite a critical report about the way in which some of that money went out. But we broadly work in the UK in a context in which there is increased support for research broadly related to development, and certainly from the perspective of the Development Studies Association, as more academics respond to those opportunities, there is a need to embed an understanding of social science, an understanding of the ways in which, for example, relations impact on outcomes, an understanding of the way in which differential power and positions within highly stratified power relations affect who gains, who loses, and what is progressed. So there's a real commitment at the Development Studies Association to encourage broadly social scientists in the field of development studies to reach out beyond those boundaries. Sarah, maybe anyway, let me say a little bit, and then if I've left anything out, Sarah, you should definitely say something. So when the Development Studies Associations began to talk about doing a series of meetings, the Economic and Social Research Council got excited about that opportunity and wanted to add to the DSA's efforts financially in order to encourage them to do more. Should I say anything more? Have I captured it? Okay, thank you. Sarah was involved a lot more than this. So if any of you are interested in that aspect, please ask her as president of the DSA. At the same time, there was another strand of resourcing going on. So Research England, which is a body that gets government funding for higher education, was passing money to universities to encourage them to build up their capabilities to respond to Global Challenges Research Fund finance. Again, this involves, in some sense, public accountability and public rigor. So again, this money began to flow out in a way really where there was very little accountability. So universities in the UK got tranches of money from what was then called HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council, and suddenly found this added to other funding they got. There was a recognition in HEFCE that there needed to be greater accountability around this. HEFCE then split, and Research England throughout, but let me not confuse you with names, sorry. So in terms of ensuring greater accountability, all universities were asked to explain how they intended to use this flow of funds. In Manchester, for example, it was increased, but it's now just over 2 million a year for 3 years. So this is really not an insignificant amount of resourcing. All the universities were asked to report on how they wanted to do that. Manchester, after some series of discussions, Dave Pollier and I were both involved in the committee, really felt that trying to put together a number of meetings which discussed on the basis of transdisciplinarity how to respond to current research challenges, and to do so through inviting our colleagues from the Global South to take part of that. Manchester really felt that that was an important area in which they wanted to invest. Related to that, we created 2 other priorities for spending that money, which I'll mention to you, because I want to flower those ideas. And you can really talk to anyone from Manchester if you have other thoughts about that. So in addition to this kind of meeting, and hopefully we'll have several more over the next 3 years, in addition to this kind of meeting, we wanted to create opportunities for postdocs to come from the Global South and spend a year in Manchester working on the issues we're going to discuss today and other transdisciplinary development challenges. And in addition to 1-year postdocs, we also wanted to create space for academics from the Global South that we wish to learn from to spend 1 or 2 months in Manchester and share and engage at greater depth. So for Manchester, this kind of meeting was one of 3 opportunities really to try and strengthen our contribution to this work. So that's a little bit of the background to why we ended up being able to bring you here. The idea, let me just say a little word about this because I think it's important. The idea is not to think about what could be research projects in a narrow or focused way. Rather, it's to reflect on some of the core challenges and some of the ways in which the people gathered here, and I've already been impressed by the depth of experience represented here, how we can begin to form transdisciplinary teams to really address these critical problems. I think one of the things that we're very conscious of is that this effort is, of course, not new. That there have been many attempts to try and think through how to create greater interdisciplinary dialogue. So we're very conscious it's not new, and we're very conscious that many of you have been involved in previous efforts. We don't want the discussions to focus overly on what has gone wrong before, but of course, where it's pertinent, we ask you to contribute those thoughts. And I think both Seth and I thought it would be important when we both shared with you what we were planning to share with you, to have a little bit of an opening in this introductory session around that. This picture is, to me sums up, I guess, the transdisciplinary challenge, particularly around these 3 areas that we're going to look at: water, energy, and transport. So this is not an informal settlement. This is a low-income settlement on the edge of Harare in Zimbabwe. This is a settlement that a group of community members negotiated from the city of Harare. A group I work with very closely belongs to a transnational network called Slum or Shack Dwellers International. This picture is about 7 years old now. This community really has gone through many efforts to provide themselves with services in a context in which the city had some top-up funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to provide them with formal infrastructure. So we see replicated there, firstly, a failed piped network around both water and sanitation. The community has to substitute for that with a borehole that they invested in themselves, and eco-sand sanitation, which they put in at some cost. Both of those have now been replicated by bulk infrastructure, conventional bulk infrastructure. Harare has something of a water crisis, so that last time I was there, which actually was only 2 months ago, they were still using the borehole. Sanitation, they've switched to sewered sanitation in most cases. Affordability is key, and I really go back. I think you highlighted it in your introduction, and I absolutely agree. I think one of the challenges that transdisciplinarity has got to apply itself to is the challenge of affordability. This settlement is quite a long way from the centre of Harare, as some of you may know, many of you possibly. A lot of the low-income areas around Harare are some distance from the centre, so serious major problems about transport. It's very expensive to travel, and the public bus system is not what it was. So as I said, I think it is worthwhile reflecting on why transdisciplinarity has been so difficult. I'll go on to say a few words about, what I think some of the constraints have been. But it's not our primary purpose of the discussions in the next 2 days. Our primary purpose to identify ways in which I think we can demonstrate new practice. So, recognizing what some of the difficulties have been, There's certainly difficulties of distance. Those of you who are familiar with the university will be aware that we talk about the North Campus and the South Campus. The North Campus is primarily the old UMIST buildings, which is a little bit of a time warp for some of us. That means, I would say, in my 15 years at Manchester, it is extraordinarily difficult to integrate well, for example, with engineers, despite the fact that, as an urban specialist, I absolutely recognise the centrality of engineering to improving the lives of the 1 in 7 of the global population that live in informal settlements. There are also, for the UK colleagues, big problems around discipline and structural incentives. So again, perhaps just to elaborate a little bit on the context for those of you who are not based in the UK, we're currently building up to respond to the research evaluation framework, the REF. The REF dominates academic thinking, I would say, around research to a really quite extraordinary extent. We're worrying about research papers, we're worrying about environment statements. All of those research papers and environment statements are done by disciplines to REF panels and sub-panels. So academics succeed in the UK, particularly at this point in the REF cycle, by being discipline experts. There is a recognition in the REF panels that interdisciplinarity is important, but the orientation is absolutely vertical. And that creates real challenges for people who want to genuinely work in transdisciplinary ways. It's testing. So we, for example, sit around and discuss whether colleagues have written too much in non-development studies journals to fit easily within our return. Those are real serious discussions that academics get involved in the UK. And of course, that pushes against innovative transdisciplinary work, which we all recognise is going to be slow at the beginning. So certainly in the UK, we face very, very serious structural constraints that pull academics away from this. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the broader UK context, because I think it's very relevant. It potentially is positive around transdisciplinarity. So there's been an integration of the different research councils into a body called UKRI. There is much more centralised management across the different research councils. So there is some recognition, in theory, that the Medical Council, the Engineering Council, Natural Sciences, Social Sciences, Arts and Humanities, all these disciplines should be working more carefully together. They are more integrated funding streams that are being designed and developed. So at one level, there's a recognition in the UK research environment going beyond universities that transdisciplinarity is really critical. There is a real concern on the basis of social scientists that social science priorities will be seen as less important in that context. That is kind of actually, you could say, in balance, being tested out at the moment. There is, I would say, among certain members of those advisory committees, senior staff, a recognition of the centrality of social science in addressing problems, a recognition that there has been, for example, too many water pumps put in that don't work for the populations that want to use them. But for some of the other senior managers and board members, that argument still has to be made. So the UK broader research environment, outside of this emphasis on university staff being judged on their disciplinary expertise, is a recognition that we need to move to transdisciplinarity, and that academics, at least in part, should be focused on addressing problems that are broadly acknowledged to be a major shortcoming in terms of ways of addressing development needs, the well-being of populations in the global south and the global north, and addressing issues of poverty and inequality. So as is broadly the case in most contexts, they're mixed opportunities and constraints. Seth and I were both a little bit hesitant about sharing with you what we saw as some of the priorities around urban infrastructure. I think we were hesitant because we're aware of the expertise in the room, but we wanted to flag a few things. So I'm going to flag 3 things, and then I'm going to pass to Seth, who's going to flag his perspectives on urban infrastructure and where it's at. and then go in to talk a little bit more about the way we've organised these 2 days. So this is a picture from a settlement in Blantyre. And I'm using it to illustrate a big concern of mine, which is although the rhetoric has shifted from the MDGs to the SDGs, the practice has not shifted. This is perhaps a little bit unfair on this toilet, because I took this picture a few years ago, but it's a good illustration of what I think is a serious problem. So the MDGs were all about helping half, and the SDGs are all about helping everyone. This was a toilet which was the only toilet in a settlement of 3,000 households. And as you see, everyone was very anxious to get their logo on this toilet. In fact, this toilet is bearing a heavy logo burden. But it is symptomatic of a real difficulty, I think, which for me has to be a priority for all research, transdisciplinary research included, that we have to think about strategies that at least offer toilets, well, to a larger number of toilets than you see here. So we have to think about how to, not how everyone can be a part of the failure, but at least how we can think about scale. Because if we don't think about scale, we are going to be pretty irrelevant. But that is a really hard ask. And I just don't see it. I don't see it in research, and I don't see it in government. That there is an understanding that we have got to move from thinking about addressing at the micro level to the meso and macro level. Okay, next. So this is a slide that is all too familiar for those of you from Nairobi. This was a fascinating visit I had when I was there, I think in August, when I got taken around the tenement blocks by someone who was a manager for the tenement block owners. And I was taken around, and this tenement block manager was very proud about the way in which these processes were organised and the finances behind the pattern of tenement development. What it illustrated to me was the real challenge that we face as academics in keeping up to speed with what is going on the ground. And I'm conscious, Arif, that you also talk about similar issues in your recent paper, housing paper, that you wrote for IIED. So what do the tenement blocks reflect? Firstly, they reflect growing populations in Nairobi, shifts of population. It is not true that every city is growing fast, but there are a lot of cities that are growing fast. And it's a real challenge to ensure that urban infrastructure keeps up to that. Secondly, the costs of these are really penal. So most families were buying 10 square feet. Buying 10 square feet took 40% of their income. Most households worked in the nearby industrial area. When we were talking about the problems of affordability, the manager of the tenement blocks talked about how terrible it was that wages were so low. That's an understandable perspective, because of course his responsibility was not to try and bring rents down. So 40% of not much money goes on buying 10 square feet. Many of those people had their children back with their parents in the rural or small town areas because they felt it was too impractical to keep children there. The way that tenement blocks are organised is shared water and sanitation, with then in most cases, about 9 or 10 rooms on each floor. So how can we keep up to speed with the way in which patterns of urban settlement are taking place and ensure that as we think about urban infrastructure, we are relevant to the ways in which human need and markets are responding? These tenement blocks are not formal, but they are formally allowed. I think that's probably a summary, a reasonable summary of the situation. So they don't conform to regulations. The person was very proud to say they put in most of the infrastructure themselves. They build the police station, which the police then come and occupy. So some kind of integration. But clearly a priority to keep up to speed with those changing dynamics. Okay, the last slide. Okay, so as some of you probably know, affordability really has been something I've been both passionate and concerned about. I'm hugely concerned that most of the development options that we are somehow responsible for are simply unaffordable to very large numbers of the population that are struggling to get on top of them. The best illustration of this for me is always sanitation, but I think it plays out really in many other services. Certainly plays out in bus rapid transit, often plays out in water. So this is an example from an informal settlement in Kampala. Continuing with the football theme, but really it wasn't planned. This is what football games that want to offer, probably on SuperSport, that you could come and watch as you went through the week. People who wanted to watch the games were being charged 20 cents, which sounds very small, and possibly is, if you are a man who controls your own income. But if you looked at the same charges for communal sanitation blocks, you can really see the affordability problem. So it was costing 5 cents to use the toilet. So if someone manages to only go 4 times a day, which itself is pretty tricky if you've tried to do it, you're talking about 20 cents for that person. A whole family, you're talking about $1. If you go, that's repeated 30 days, $30. Incomes are always very hard to assess in this context, but broadly the average, reasonably accurate average income, $48, maybe $50. No one can afford sanitation. But that simple calculation very rarely lies behind the kind of solutions that are developed for infrastructure. What are average incomes? What are the incomes of the bottom 40%? What can they afford? What is the cost of the solutions that we are delivering? So for me, a major priority of any transdisciplinary research has got to be to really think about how we can address the needs of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged, the lowest income, perhaps not the bottom 5 or 10%, but certainly the lowest 40%. So, as I said, Seth and I thought about what we wanted to say, and those were really, for me, the 3 challenges that I wanted to present you with. The challenge of affordability, the challenge of keeping up to speed with urban trends, and the challenge of moving beyond the half, almost half, to everyone and thinking about inclusion.